All right, hope everybody's doing well. Welcome back for this week's lecture. Today we're going to talk about the final book of the New Testament canon, the book of Revelation. So we're just going to have one lecture on it. We absolutely cannot cover everything, um, but we'll get to talk about it today. We sort of worked our way from the Gospels through Paul, and then we'll touch on Revelation as well. If we had more time, we could spend more time talking about the general epistles, Hebrews, Acts. We didn't get to spend much time on, but today we'll get to talk about Revelation. Revelation for the last, century and a half or so, maybe 200 years, has really enjoyed, a special place in American Protestantism, especially with sort of the rise of dispensational theology in the United States. Um, and, this dispensational theology has sort of a high emphasis on, um, the end times, things like the rapture, like a pre-tribulational rapture. And this is in all of Protestantism, of course, but very influential on American Protestant Christianity for the last century to 2 centuries. And so, because of that, Revelation has played a pretty key role in American Protestantism in the last couple hundred years. People interested in the end times and sort of reading current world events through certain texts in the book of Revelation, thinking about things like a so-called rapture of the church. Revelation has not always been so popular for the church. If we think back to, the first few centuries of early Christianity, Revelation didn't have the easiest time getting into the New Testament. Plenty of, early Christians were not totally sure what to do with it. It is very different than anything else in the New Testament. We do have similar things sort of by means of genre in the Old Testament, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Based on genre, it's pretty different from the rest of the New Testament. The message is of Revelation is not always easily discernible to be in line with other parts of the New Testament. Um, there's questions about authorship that come up. Uh, you know, it does make its way in there, but many people are not quite sure about it in the first few centuries. And even later figures like Martin Luther, um, he's he's not a huge fan of the book. He's just not totally sure about its authority in the same way he would be about like the Gospels or something like that. But in our current context, people seem to be fascinated by the book of Revelation, and they come with all sorts of assumptions about what the text must be saying. And so we'll think about some of these today. But let's go ahead and jump in and think about interpretive models, or maybe you could call these interpretive approaches to the book of Revelation. So if you can see here, we've got preterist, historicist, futurist, idealist, and then eclectic. If you don't know the word eclectic, it essentially means we'll take elements from each of the prior four. So these are sort of models or frameworks with which people approach the book. They drive really our foundational assumptions about what the book is doing and what it might be saying. And these, I mean, really impact how you read the book. If you take a preterist approach versus a futurist approach, for example, you will interpret this book completely differently. And although many people are not always aware of the approach that they are taking, like maybe they might not be able to tell you that they're like a historicist or something, um, they do often fall into these camps, even if they can't name that. And it's worth our time to think about approaches and methodology. Um, if you don't choose your approach or if you don't choose your methodology, one will choose you, and you will have one even if you're not aware of it. So it is, I think, helpful for us to really self-consciously think about interpretive models and approaches. So let's talk about each of these briefly. So first, we've got this sort of preterist approach is our first one. This approach would read the book of Revelation and say all of the events that happen here in the book take place in the first century. And pretty much all of them probably before 70 AD. If you remember, this date is important. This is when the Jerusalem temple is destroyed during the Jewish revolt against Rome, 70. And so this is sort of an anchor date. And the preterist approach would say, you know, all of these things that the book of Revelation talks about, from beginning to end, maybe excluding this sort of return of Christ. But pretty much everything, for the most part, happens in the first century, like in the lifetime of the recipients, the earliest readers of this book. Much of it has already happened by the time this book is being written. So this is one approach, very sort of historically focused, trying to, you know, look at the imagery in the book. And you would, you know, think of the mark of the beast, for example, and you would try to identify something within the first century before the year 70 that sort of correlates or corresponds to the description of the mark of the beast in Revelation. So one way people do this, if you go to Revelation 13 and you read this mark of the beast 666 thing, what you see is it's a mark that appears on people's right hand and on their forehead. And if they don't get the mark, which the author encourages them not to, if they don't get the mark, they will not be able to buy or sell or trade or do any of this thing. So some people who take a preterist approach, they would say, okay, this must be referring to something that happens in the first century. What kinds of things were happening that could be signified by a mark on the hand or the forehead? And without this mark, a person would not be able to buy or trade or sell. And some scholars have looked to the marketplace, the Roman agora, where there would often be like a statue or some sort of image of the Roman Caesar at the time. And when you would enter the agora, the marketplace, you would take like a pinch of incense when you were entering, and you would like dash it at the image of Caesar. And you do this sort of to like show your allegiance, your loyalty to Rome. And then when you do that, they would put a mark on your hand. And when this happens, you can then you are free to buy and sell and trade in the marketplace. But without it, you can't do that. And so some who take a preterist approach would say, when John writes about the mark of the beast, he is talking about this phenomenon that was present in the first century. This is not some like future thing that hasn't happened yet for John. He is writing about a real problem that his readers are facing in their own day. And so we have to locate it at that time. That's an example of a preterist reading of Revelation, but that's could happen throughout the whole book. Pick any imagery that you want, and this sort of thing could be present. Next, a historicist model for reading Revelation. Sometimes this gets mixed up with preterist. You know, it sounds like historical, like it must be in the first century or something. But this would be something like if we are reading Revelation now, if we take a historicist view, we can look back over the last, 2,000 years of history, and we can see that Revelation was sort of like a roadmap for interpreting history. So, Revelation predicted events maybe that were happening in the, 4th century and the 5th century with like the fall of the Roman Empire. Or, maybe things that are going on in the Middle East in the last 100 years or 80 years or so. maybe we can really understand that based on the book of Revelation, that we can look throughout history and see where Revelation has been sort of providing this map for understanding these events. So that's the historicist model. The futurist model, um, the futurist model would say, so in chapters 2 and 3 in Revelation, you've got these 7 letters to the churches in Asia Minor. Um, and these are letters, but then chapters 4 through the end of the book, all of that, everything after the letters, these are yet to happen. John seeing this vision in chapters 4 and onward. As we read it today, that stuff is still in the future. So preterist thinks it's all in the first century. Historicists think it's between the first century and now. Futurist says it still hasn't happened. This will tell us about the future from where we stand today. So all of that hasn't happened yet. Finally, we have the idealist approach. And an idealist model would essentially read the book in very general terms, uh, telling us that it's training us to see the world through sort of the ideals of good and evil, like a cosmic struggle between good and evil. And so there might be like historical reference to some of these events, past, present, or future. But it's really giving us more of like, these sorts of conflicts. Think about the lamb and the beast, or the dragon or the harlot. These things happen over and over again in human history. These are cyclical. These are patterns that appear over and over again. It's not necessarily referring to like any one event, but these are things that happen sort of in every generation. Fifth, this final view is the eclectic view, which tries to take, sort of the strengths of each of these views and sort of put them together. I won't show my hand and say which approach I take straight out. I will talk about a weakness that I see with the historicist and the futurist approach. And within American Protestantism, particularly evangelicalism, these two have really dominated the sort of interpretive models of Christians. So either seeing that, these things, it's a roadmap for discerning history, or Revelation is about things that still today have not happened. This is about, the end of history, the end times. I think the weakness with that, is that very clearly John is writing this book for those 7 churches in Asia Minor. He has a first century audience in mind when he writes it. And I think the problem that I would see with these approaches, the historicist and the futurist, is that it makes it really difficult to think that this whole, 22 chapter book would have made any sense to the earliest readers if it's only something that's, off in the distant future from them. It seems that the purpose of the book, we'll talk about this more in a minute, is to encourage God's people to stay faithful to Jesus in the face of suffering and persecution. And that's like what the whole thing is doing. And I think if most of the book is about telling the future and events that haven't even happened yet, I don't know how it accomplishes that purpose for its earliest readers. I think that's a fundamental weakness of those two approaches. It's not to say those two approaches don't have anything to help us out with. But I think they do come up short there. These images have to have meant something, I think, to John's earliest readers, if this book is meant to originally to encourage them in their own sort of first century context. But that's enough about approaches. Let's move forward. And here we can think about sort of the genre, or genres plural, of the book of Revelation. So we've talked a little bit about genre this semester. We talked about it with the Gospels. If you remember, we talked about how the Gospels are Greco-Roman biography, at least in part. They might have other sort of genre attached, or they might be participating in other genres. But I think dominantly the Gospels in the New Testament are biographies, the Greco-Roman biographies. And if we want to be good and careful readers of the Gospels, we need to know something about how these sorts of texts, these biographies, functioned in the ancient world, both in the composition process, the writing, how authors went about composing biographies, and in sort of shared expectations of readers, like what would the reader have expected of a biography, and how does that impact the way you would interpret the book? Genre, if you don't remember the way we define genre, it's sort of this like unspoken contract between a reader and a writer. So the writer puts a work within a certain genre, and the genre sort of gives expectations for the work. And the reader who understands the genre rightly will also carry those expectations. Now, the author can break those expectations, break sort of the limits of a genre. Um, then, if a reader knows the genre it's participating in, when a reader sees or hears sort of the breaking of genre convention, that's when your antenna goes up as a reader, and you should say, "This is strange. I wonder why the reader is doing that." So, what is the genre of the Book of Revelation? Well, sort of three options, and I think it's all of these things. First, epistolary. This is the adjectival form of the word epistle. So remember, Paul writes epistles, letters in the New Testament. These are circumstantial texts. So Romans, for example, is circumstantial. And by that, I mean, Paul does not sit down one day and think, man, I want to write a systematic theology textbook, so let me write Romans. When Paul writes an epistle, whether it's Romans or First Thessalonians or Galatians, he is responding to something. There is another, sort of side of the coin of communication that we don't always have access to. But these epistles never occur in a vacuum. What we don't get in the New Testament is just people deciding it would be fun to write an epistle. They're responding to something. Usually, it's some sort of crisis. Now, crisis could mean persecution. It doesn't have to, but sometimes it does. Um, Sometimes it's doctrinal. Think about Galatians, for example. Paul has opponents in the region of Galatia who he is fiercely, writing against. Similar in, Colossians, for example. And we can work to try to uncover who these opponents are. But the point is, Paul or, James or Peter or whoever it is, these epistles are responding to something. And when you read chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, this is these 7 epistles, 7 letters to these churches in Asia Minor. You can read each of those, and John, the Lord speaking through John, is responding to the state that they're in. Some of it is crisis, some of it's persecution, some of it is some sort of, maybe spiritual apathy or abrogation or apostasy from, the faith that these people have received. But it's all responding to something. And these are the recipients of the book of Revelation, these churches mentioned in chapters 2 and 3. This is who the book is for. So epistolary. First, that's part of the genre. Second, we can think about prophetic, the prophetic genre. And when we hear that word in English, a lot of times we think of prophetic as a term about predicting the future. So prophecy is all about, predicting future things. We often love to emphasize, like in the prophets in the Old Testament, like Isaiah, for example, has these prophecies about, the Messiah and how he would need to come and be born of a virgin and suffer and do all these things. And that's part of prophecy. But if we limit it to that, we are really going to have sort of this anemic understanding of prophecy, both in the Old Testament and here. Prophecy, a prophet is somebody who speaks on behalf of God in the Bible. And it's a person who's commissioned by God to speak on his behalf to God's people, often warning of coming judgment. So, often God's people have strayed from faithfulness to the covenant that God has made. And so these people, these prophets, they warn of coming judgment. They exhort the people to, be faithful to the Lord. And then they often have this sort of component of, restoration and hope. So warning of judgment, admonition, exhortation towards fidelity, faithfulness to the Lord, and a look towards future hope. This is sort of included in most of the prophetic literature. And so John's revelation, the apocalypse here, is prophetic in that sense. There is warnings about future judgment. There are admonitions to be faithful to Jesus, the saints who endure in his name. And there is also, definitely an aspect of looking forward to future hope. We also see in verse 3 of the prologue, Revelation 1:3, there's this sort of authorial note to the reader, which is really interesting. We don't get a lot like this in the New Testament. This is like breaking the third wall, the fourth wall. What is it when a TV character, looks at the camera and says something like Ferris Bueller's Day Off? He looks at the audience and speaks. The fourth wall. Here we get, blessed is the one who reads, and those who hear the words of this prophecy, calling the book a prophecy, and those who keep the things that are written in it, for the time is near. So we get this sort of self-designation of prophecy in that. So epistolary, prophetic. Finally, and maybe most importantly, probably most importantly, apocalyptic. Whatever else Revelation is, it is a Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic work. And it might not be Second Temple in the sense that it could be written after the fall of the Jerusalem temple, but it participates within this tradition of Jewish apocalyptic literature. And when we hear the word apocalyptic, we often think of the end of the world when we think of like the apocalypse, maybe the zombie apocalypse or something. That's not necessarily what apocalyptic means when we think about it in the Bible. So apocalyptic here is a Greek word, apokalypsis is the noun form. And this is a compound word, or we can think about the verb form, apokalypto. Apa is a preposition which means, from or away from. Kalupto is to cover, or a kalupsis is like a veil or a covering. And so apa, taking away from the cover, it's like removing the veil. It's pulling back the curtain is the idea of apocalypse. And this is a, fairly common form of discourse in the Second Temple period in ancient Judaism. So we get, in the Bible, certain sections of the book of Daniel are apocalyptic. Daniel gets these visions in heaven, sort of in the middle and back half of the book of Daniel. The book of First Enoch is maybe like a 3rd century BC apocalyptic work. It writes under the name of Enoch, that figure from Genesis 5, I believe. Enoch is walking around. Enoch is this guy who gets taken up into heaven in Genesis. You remember, he doesn't die. He gets swept up, taken up. And First Enoch, written, chronologically much later than the historical person of Enoch would have lived, writes under the name of Enoch and talks about, sort of what he sees in heaven, and tries to explain the current state of God's people from God's perspective. And so it's, again, pulling back the curtain. That's not the only thing First Enoch is doing, but that is part of it. The Book of Jubilees is another apocalyptic work. But Revelation, if you have your Bibles open, Revelation 1:1, the first word of the book is apocalypsis, apocalypsis, the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, which was given, which God gave to him to show to his servants that which is necessary to happen soon. And he signified, he showed, having sent through his angel to his servant John, who testified the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ, which he saw. We have this visual thing. So there's this apocalypse, this revelation of Jesus Christ. And there are these things which John saw. So maybe, you'll read somewhere or hear John called the seer, Seer, the one who sees. And that's, John relays a lot in this book about things he saw, things that were shown to him. And it helps the people to whom this work is written, it helps them to understand their own present moment and the state of God's people through the lens of how God is understanding and showing things to be true. It's pulling back the curtain and providing a sort of heavenly or divine perspective on the present moment. Should also mention Jewish apocalyptic literature is generally sort of like national political crisis literature, like sort of the social political contexts in which apocalyptic literature arises is when the group of people who produces the work or the community of the person who produces it is in a moment of crisis. So this could be, some sort of geopolitical oppression. That's usually what's happening. To put this more positively or negatively, people who are doing really well and winning don't produce apocalyptic literature. This stuff is written by people who are down and out and, trying to make sense of their current suffering and persecution and the moment they're living through. This is true both outside of the Bible and Jewish literature and here in Revelation. This is a moment of crisis is where this sort of literature gets picked up. Apocalyptic literature often does have a temporal component to it. It's often accompanied by like the end of the world, sort of eschatological concerns. Not always, though. It would be a mistake to reduce apocalyptic to thinking about time and the end of the world. The main thing, it seems, is about revealing God's perspective on things for God's people in a moment of crisis for the purpose of comfort and hope. So Revelation is epistolary, it's prophetic, and it is apocalyptic. We need to remember all of these things as we approach the book. Moving forward. So let's think about apocalyptic imagery in the book of Revelation. These are 4 levels of communication or 4 levels of meaning by which we get, some original phenomenon, and then its interpretation and its communication and its reception and subsequent reinterpretation by the audience. This is fairly complex because for apocalyptic literature, the idea is that the seer, here John, for First Enoch, it would be Enoch. This person sees something, and then they have to write it down, but communicate it in such a way that people, their audience can make sense of it. If you think about, like 2 Corinthians 10, this sort of thorn in the flesh bit for Paul, he reveals that he went up to the third heaven and he saw things and heard things which cannot be uttered by a person, like things which cannot be spoken and things which he cannot describe. The job of the apocalypticist, the person who's a visionary in this sense, is to take what they see in the heavenly realm and transmit it, communicate it in such a way that their audience can make sense of it. Now, this might mean that they are using heavily symbolic imagery to explain what they see. Or it could be that they are just trying, very woodenly and literally to explain what they saw. When John here sees these creatures with 4 faces in chapter 4, drawing on, Ezekiel chapter 1, is that actually what he sees? Is he seeing a creature with 4 faces? This lion, the ox, the eagle, and the human? Or is he using that imagery to tell us something about the nature of what he's seeing? Is this symbolic or is this literal? So let's move through these levels. The linguistic level of apocalyptic imagery. The question here is, what does the text actually say? So when John sees, a creature with 4 faces, that's what the text actually says. Our interpretive process does not end there. One bit that we need to really nail down here, I have written intertextuality. Now, this is a fancy word for talking about, for our purposes, how does the New Testament author interact with other texts that were previously written, mainly the Old Testament. We don't get to talk about it a ton today, but every single page of the book of Revelation, this is true of the whole New Testament for the most part, but especially Revelation, John is over and over and over again drawing on drawing on imagery and words from the Old Testament. If you see an image, if you read an image or hear some imagery in Revelation that you're not sure about what it means, the first place you should look to understand it is the Old Testament. Every single time. There's a chance it's not from there, but more often than not, this is exactly where this author is pulling from. Good. So, linguistic level, what does the text actually say? Behind that, the visionary level, what is John actually seeing? Which might or might not be the exact same as what he says. Third, the referential level. So on the assumption that John is seeing these events and they sort of have some connection or reference to a historical event, whether that's in the future or sometime in the last 2,000 years or in the first century, they've referred to something. What would the original readers have heard as the sort of historical reference? And then finally, the symbolic level. Based on how we understand the symbolism of Revelation, how does this impact the way that we think about whatever this historical reference is? So if you take, back to the Mark of the Beast example, if you're a preterist and you take this to be referring to, marketplace, first century stuff with, allegiance to Caesar, marks on the hand, and buying and selling in the marketplace, you might take that sort of symbolic imagery and the number 666 to be referring to this deal about first century allegiance to Caesar. There are ways where you can use this practice of gematria, which is where you take each letter of a word and assign it a numerical value. And 666 gives you the name of one of the Caesars. So we have to think through all of these levels whenever we are interpreting a text from Revelation. What I would really hope to emphasize here, if you only take one thing away, if you are going to teach or preach a text from Revelation, if you have your passage and you do not pretty thoroughly understand how John is interacting with the Old Testament, you are not ready to teach or preach that text. You will get it wrong if you miss the Old Testament imagery. John assumes that we know our Old Testaments backwards and forwards, and he is referring to it all the time. So if you can only take one thing away, that's the thing. Finally, we'll talk about some major themes. We've already hit on most of this. We'll breeze through this and then call it. First, eschatological imminence. That's just a fancy way to say the end is here. As John writes in the first century, he does seem to think that the end of that song by REM, it's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. He seems to think that the end of all things is here. As Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 10, you, Corinthians, are people upon whom the ends of the ages have come. John, at the very beginning of this prophecy, at the end of verse 3, says, the time is near. The time for these things to happen, presumably. He ends the book by saying, Jesus says that he's coming soon, that this return is imminent. It is coming soon. So there's this real sense of urgency that the end of it is here throughout the book. The next 2 points, faithfulness to Christ and empire, really go hand in hand. I think John is seeing some sort of crisis with his audience, struggling with faithfulness to Christ over against allegiance to the empire and to Caesar. That he is concerned that their allegiance to the empire will sort of overtake their allegiance to Christ. And he really does not want that to happen. Think about the imagery. I believe chapter 18, 19, John, describes the empire as this great prostitute or harlot. And John uses language, come out of her, my people, right? Sexually explicit imagery. Don't sleep with the empire. Don't get in bed with the powers of the day, because Christ is coming back soon. And when he does, you better not be in bed with the great harlot, with the empire. There's sort of be faithful to Christ, not Caesar. So those are major themes. Next, there's judgment, which is closely related to that. The judgment of the empire and the merchants of the world and the corrupt world system is coming soon. And if you are in bed with it, you're going to receive the judgment as well. So separate, come out of her, my people. And then finally, common to apocalyptic literature is dualism. Temporal dualism we talked about, this sort of clash between the ages, the present age and the age to come. The end has invaded the present. This sort of like ethical dualism between good and evil, represented by, Jesus, the lamb, and the beast, the harlot. You have to pick a side. These things are diametrically opposed, and you cannot serve both of these things. So those are some of the major themes for the book of Revelation. If you want a book recommendation to read, Greg Beale, G.K. Beale, has written a lot of good stuff on Revelation. Richard Bauckham is another scholar who has written well on Revelation. Know your Old Testament. It's good to have some sort of Bible with cross-references so you can, there's a lot of imagery you might not pick up on from the Old Testament, but it's good to have a tool that can point you there. Yeah, think about, even if you don't take a preterist view, I think you should probably consider the strengths of that view. And what would this have meant to a first century reader under the thumb of the Roman Empire? That's not the end of the interpretive process. We do have to think about, what does it mean for God's people now, who do not really in America find themselves in a similar persecuted position to the people in the first century. So Revelation, this book has immense value for God's people today. It has a lot to speak to the church, how we think about political interaction, how we think about faithfulness to Christ and the empires of our day. And so definitely one worth pondering. Should be taught more in churches, but taught responsibly. There's a lot of sort of nonsensical teaching of this book that goes around because, people have no respect for the sense that this book is a work of first century apocalyptic literature. Um, and if you don't have an eye towards that and the Old Testament, you're going to get it wrong. It's as simple as that. So I hope this was helpful. Great book. Read it over and over and over again. John, at the beginning, he says, you'll be blessed if you read this book and keep the things written in it. So we can take him up on that. But I hope you're enjoying this, and I hope this was helpful. Have a good one.